welcome everybody to this Classes and Elites Research Seminar. My name is Marntoft, and I am a postdoc in sociology at the University of Oslo, and I'm also a co-host of this seminar. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this seminar series, you can follow us on Twitter on Class Elites to keep up with upcoming seminars. And we also post all of our links for the seminars in the on our website that you will find there. So a couple of years ago, I read this book, Rich Russians by Elisabeth Schimpfössl, which offers an in-depth account of the lives and outlooks of the Russian multimillionaires and billionaires. And since reading this book, we've been eager to introduce Elisabeth to our seminar, and today she's here. So Elisabeth holds a PhD from the University of Manchester, and she is now a lecturer in sociology and policy at Aston University. And in addition to her research into sociology of elites, she's also done extensive work with comparative research into media and journalism in post-communist Europe. But today we will hear more about the rich Russians and their morality of success. And Elisabeth, you'll have about 30 minutes or so, and then afterwards we will open up the floor for a joint discussion. So Elisabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My talk of today is based on an article which I started writing last spring and was writing on for a ridiculous amount of time. It's just kind of, I had to read up a lot for this new idea, and I just got completely caught up in it. And you just said, I was wondering, in sociology we like the plural form. Should I be calling it moralities of success rather than morality of success? But I haven't yet quite made up my mind. Anyway, it kind of was a troubling article, and then there was a situation where I could discuss it with a group of researchers. I'm just checking now, is Hannah here? She was part of the group and very, very helpful. No, she isn't. I saw her attending on Facebook. And the final result was one that brought me a little bit away from just the kind of Russian view, but rather start pondering about how various disciplines relate to each other and communicate with each other, or rather don't communicate and have a certain insular existence. And I think in terms of research into elites, that's quite a shame that is happening, and then kind of have this idea of appealing for that to be changed. And I was very, very happy when then it was just after this discussion, and I went back to the article, so with this reading group, and rewrote it, and just at the time Marin's invitation came in, and I thought, oh, that's just brilliant, because I think such an international crowd as there is here, it's just ideal to discuss my ideas with. I prepared to talk, and I will have slides. I hate PowerPoints, so I got into Prezi, which then kind of like a little child makes me play around. I prepared to talk about 10 or so days ago, but last night when I got back, I thought, oh, gosh, is that boring? It's kind of there's so much more to what I want to say in terms of my own history in the last 10 years that I thought I'd rather tell you about that than just put it into kind of abstract terms. If you're more interested in the more academic argument I have, I'm happy to send any of you my draft article if you're interested in it. It's still under review, so maybe it will never see the light of the world, but that shouldn't hinder me to send it to anybody. So let's go back about 10 years. At the time I was doing my PhD at Manchester University and was doing my interviews, and I got in the end 40 of them with multimillionaires and billionaires. And one of my main conclusions, still reflected in the book, the subtitle is From Oligarchs to Bourgeoisie, was that I was quite surprised how quick the process has gone of this show of ostentatious super rich of the 90s, these rogues that kind of are loved by the yellow press with their lavish behavior, how quickly they've turned into something I would compare to what we saw in the late 19th century in the States, basically from robber barons to respectable gentlemen, even though of course there's a strong sort of post-Soviet touch to the Russians. And it was also the time I was finishing my PhD, and all kind of people started advising me what to do next, and they liked my argument. They found it very interesting, this bourgeoisification process, but then almost anonymously would say, well, it would be really interesting for your next project if you did something, you know, comparing your Russians with elites in China, elites in the Indian subcontinent, or elites in the Gulf states, and how they go to Harrods and splash out their money and all the kind of things. I was thinking, so it's a bit odd, because my argument is one that actually doesn't make it so very much interesting to look at how people behave at Harrods, but rather I think it's rather kind of, I'd rather compare these Russian elites to the West, because I felt like they provide a certain kind of, almost a kind of a brutal mirror to Western elites. But I thought, okay, if someone took me onto a project to compare them with emerging elites, fine. But if it was my own project, I'd actually rather do my own thing, what I'm more interested in. And eventually got also funding for it. It was comparing philanthropists in Russia and the UK, but I actually never found any interest in this very comparative side, because it's something very odd. People can make big statements about fighting a Eurocentric or Western-centric view in sociology and how we should kind of change around our lens. But whenever I was talking about this comparison, you could literally see people gazing off. They had absolutely no interest in it. And the same was the case with my media research. My colleague and I came to a certain kind of conclusion recently that actually what's been happening in Russia, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries is quite interesting in terms of how oligarchization works. In our case, in terms of the media empires, but also more general. And there again, it was something nobody ever wants to hear, that. So that Russia, Eastern Europe could be something I suggest we should be looking at in order to see what might be happening in the West. It's not an argument I've ever felt that sociologists in the West or social scientists in general are very open to. So, but yeah, in the end I did, thanks to this second project, I did another 40 interviews, and so 8 in total, and they got into this book. But now the other side of the coin, I'm going now back about a little less than 10 years. So after I defended my PhD, I tried to find a publisher for a book. And at first it was wonderful. I had kind of was invited and quoted by the best publishers in the world, absolute top notch. And I sent in my proposal, and then the first reviews came in, and had they been just hostile, that would have been quite flattering. They were by and large, most of them absolutely ridiculing me. And I couldn't understand, yes, of course it makes sense, because what would a publisher do? They would send my proposal to someone who's got in their CV a trajectory of researching Russian elites. And that's the other problem with the site. That's by and large, or basically exclusively, what I call Kremlinologists. So people who've out of a tradition of Sovietology, look at elites and power in Russia from a very kind of a narrow political science perspective or economic perspectives. They're interested maximum on how rich people relate to the Kremlin and vice versa, maybe with aspects of foreign policy and moments like that. But my sociological approach and also my interviews and also my interest in kind of I was trying to integrate in my research all kind of ideas that are most of us probably discuss in our research on Elise from a sociological perspective, and that was just something they could not possibly relate to. So there's this kind of insularity of criminology, at the same time also a lack of interest among Western elite researchers by and large, kind of if I generalize it. And I think that's a shame, because in fact, there are quite a number of things among the Russian elites that I think kind of could be quite interesting also to compare precisely with Western ones. And I'm now going to share my screen to show you my presentation. So hopefully that will work. So now I just need to get into the present modus. So what I'm going to do now is I'll talk you through a few points of my research and my research findings and my analysis, and then get back to why I think that might be interesting beyond the borders of Russia. And one aspect that's been almost unavoidable to get to any kind of understanding or any analysis or kind of to make sense of what people told me. What for me was very, very important was to take a historical perspective on things. So one very, very noticeable thing was that a lot of people, when I asked them why they think they've become so successful, talked about their genes and their good genetic setup, what they inherited from their parents and so on. And in some comments, I wasn't quite sure whether it was kind of a flippant statement and they rather meant it maybe metaphorically. But then I got a number of statements that were just so clearly they actually mean it. One example is Yekaterina. Yekaterina is the wife of a billionaire. So when I asked her why she's become so successful, she could basically just have said, well, I married well. She didn't. She said, and she was kind of annoyed. She kind of, and I was got impatient with me and said, oh, listen, Elisabeth, I got genes from my parents. Of course, the genes allowed me to develop on all the qualities that led to my success. And then she gave me a long talk about how her parents made their way from being from peasant families, from Ukraine, kind of remote areas, elsewhere in the Soviet Union, from the countryside, and how they were very simple people, but they've achieved a lot in science, both of them, and they achieved it because of their own capabilities and of the kind of genetic setup they had. And then later on, Yekaterina's husband joined us, and he then talked about their son, one of them, who is especially gifted, and said, well, my son's much better than I am. And that is, well, I'm not bad either. It's probably thanks to, he just told me before he's atheist, but it's probably thanks to God and to the good genes he received. So I was then wondering, where does it come from? Because of course, many people found that quite shocking, this strong conviction in being biologically superior. And my explanation, which I found, was Yekaterina, when she grew up in the 1960s, it was a time when genetics just research, so academic science research into genetics was just about to be allowed again, which is quite an odd thing, because if you go back to the early Soviet Union, it was just exactly nature that and Marx's idea of your environment determines your being, and also then the idea of the early Soviet Union of creating this new Soviet man, that all this kind of then took a backseat to genetic ideas. But there was also a pre-story. Stalin in the late 40s banned any research into genetics. And when it was allowed again, it was especially a certain parts of the intelligentsia with conservative leanings who embraced it full on. But at the same time, in the 1960s, what the Soviet Union missed out on was a process, in contrast to the West, where you had all the kind of feminist movements, social sciences developing much more rapidly. And also this kind of questioning, especially from feminists, of whether certain repressive hierarchies are man-made or actually given by nature as the view was beforehand. And this whole questioning, I would say, then also led to a development that made people much more cautious to make such statements as Russian did. But obviously in the Soviet Union, this generation and also the following generations were completely cut off from any such discourse. Of course, it's also important if you just have good genes to become successful. There's little merit in it. So all this kind of claims to biological superiority usually go together with people referring to their hard work, their strong work ethic, their discipline, their willpower, and all these kind of personality traits. So did also Ekaterina, who said, well, it takes obviously hard work to flourish. My parents possessed natural biological resources, which they managed to make the most of. They had a thirst for education, culture, and certain lifestyle, both of them, and I inherited this. So what we also have in this kind of this references to this thirst for education and this kind of a decent lifestyle brings us back to the intelligentsia and intelligentsia values in which more than a large majority of my interviewees were born into, and this is also something other studies have shown is true for most, a large majority of the elites in Russia. And there it's very important to exactly this kind of decency and inner strength that they stress that, because it's also something that is widely admired in the still till now in the among the Russian population in general. So it's a very, very good tool to legitimize yourself and your privileges. And there's also something that allows people to kind of find a certain anchoring in the past. They obviously came from, came rich out of no any basis of wealth or no bourgeois tradition in their family or anything of that sort in a Western type of sense, but have therefore to rely exactly on this type of intelligentsia values that signal their moral worth. Some of them, and that was quite interesting, and I got them in the second part of my research, especially billionaires had an additional touch to that. Philanthropy has risen massively in the Soviet Union, and many of the super rich set up their own foundations. And some of them you see here on the photo. It's Irina Sedich. Her husband is tycoon in metallurgy, and she runs her husband's foundation, and she told me that for her it's very, very important to engage the population and to make them participate in her philanthropy. And her idea behind it is that through that she wants to instill a certain kind of sense of civil society and civil duty into common people, and basically enlighten them to with the aim to set up or build up a civil society. Irina Sedich is not the first one who's had this idea. Prior to them, and you see that on the photo in the middle, that's a foundation called Linia Жизни, Lifeline, which was set up, we'll see in a moment, by Piotr Aven and other shareholders of Alpha Bank Russia's biggest private bank. And they had an idea right from the start. So what they did was they only offered, even though of course they're all super, super rich, they only offered money for the administrative side of their foundation, but all the kind of money they needed to, what they do is surgeries for very ill children, is done through fundraising among the ordinary population. They again have this big idea of enlightening the Russian people to bring them closer to the idea of civil society, but also in addition to that, to find a way to legitimize private capital, which obviously in Russia has a very dodgy reputation. So briefly, the kind of sense of collective superiority that has developed quite strongly, especially among people from the later generation and also people who have maybe a little bit less dealings with the West. They are all very concerned about distinguishing themselves from especially the middle classes, especially also, of course, the Russian population in general. And many of them, if you just briefly, Yekaterina, for example, and her husband are very, very concerned about also not to be mixed up with the ordinary rich and their fellow rich in Russia, but have a more kind of cultured image to them. But collectively, they still have this kind of narrative that they are better than the West. They're much more energetic, they're much more hands-on, they're much more vibrant. And a very important argument here is, while it took the West about 200 years to develop capitalism, they managed the same in 20 years. One of the people who made such claims, you have him on the photo here, is Pripachkin. Yuri Pripachkin. He is a business partner of Viktor Vekselberg, of whom you might have heard. He was the one who brought back the Fabergé eggs and put them in the Hermitage. Now he's got a separate museum around them. And what is important here is another thing. Just go back for a moment to the philanthropy side and also the collective superiority combined with individual superiority, is in all these kind of things, they have a certain, so by and large, when people make their references to the Soviet intelligentsia upbringing, Soviet intelligentsia, meaning all the academically trained medics, academics, scientists, engineers, and so on and so forth, it by and large has little to do with the previous intelligent thinking of working for the people, being the duty of the people, and developing Russia as a whole. With this kind of ideas of creating and instilling in people civil society spirits, historically I would say that almost has a little bit an allusion to the Narodniki of the 1860s and 70s, who they made a bit bigger sacrifice. They went into the countryside with the effort to teach people, enlighten them, and so on. And we see a certain kind of repetition, not in deeds, but in the kind of thinking of people and what they refer to. And in general, it's very important because the intelligentsia as such is the major reference point for a lot of Russians to understand themselves and legitimize themselves. There's sometimes then also obscure situations. Denis, a young guy, I met him in London. His father was the 300th richest man in the world in the 90s. They of course had lived in the most glamorous suburb of Moscow. They had all kind of Yeltsin visiting, the political elites, of course, a lot of oligarchs and so on, and basically lived a complete rich man's lifestyle. But Denise, I asked him what he thinks of class society in Britain and where he thinks he belongs to. And he said, well, he can't relate to class society in Britain at all. It's absolutely terrible. These kind of big boundaries between the classes and how influential it is on how people think and act and what life chances they have. But then he thought of it and thought, if he would identify with a social group, then it would be the intelligentsia. And his understanding was of the intelligentsia, as he explained to me, that's been a group that's always been separate from the common people, has always been highly educated, very sophisticated, and much more enlightened. And that's the one kind of part he can see himself in. And it's quite important for their thinking. They don't necessarily think of themselves as rich people in the first place, but much rather as a leading part of some enlightened social class. Along that thinking is another last part, and that is a strong belief in private capital. So here on the photo, the person giving a speech, that's Piotr Awen. He's been around for a very long time. He would also be someone who clearly would say, oh, I've got nothing to do whatsoever with all this kind of rogue rich. He also said to me, and this kind of quite indicative for his background and his attempts to distinguish himself. He said, well, and entrepreneurialism is talent. It's equally divided in each society. But of course, you need to have an environment to have all the entrepreneurial skills flourish. And he said, actually, he didn't have those talents himself. He was much more made to become a scientist, which he also was at first. He finished his PhD in the 80s and then went into academia and worked alongside the next person in the middle, Igor Gaidar. And Gaidar was the leader of the reform movement, became prime minister in '92, when he then also made Awen one of his ministers. And what Awen very clearly says is this kind of very, very strong belief that, and also kind of the policies they implemented in those years with their shock therapy and rapid liberalization, that you need to first make sure that there's a strong entrepreneurial class, and then everything else will fall in place. So where there's kind of a very, very strong private capital that's secured and flourishing, people then will invest in philanthropy, and also the idea is eventually that should replace and supplant the state. So any state infrastructure, welfare should preferably be provided from medicine, college, education, everything by philanthropists. And in their thinking, they very strongly till now adhere to Pinochet. In the 70s and 80s, Russian intelligentsia people very, very closely followed what was going on in Chile, and they adored Pinochet for, of course, his anti-communism, but at the same time also this kind of pure idea of neoliberal reforms. Awen himself in the early 2000s went so far to he tried to talk Putin into implementing some dictatorial measures in order to further implement privatizations and other reforms of that sort. And when I met him in, I think it was 2017, I was curious about how he, what his take was now on Pinochet. He's lived in London for God knows how many years, and he's also someone absolutely admired by Western elites. He has a wonderful art collection, and I guess many of you might have encountered some of his arts subjects. He lends them a lot to the best museums all over the world. And also because of his good taste, he's absolutely an absolute darling of the Western media, who've never been any bothered about his rather anti-democratic ideas. So when I met him in 2017, I asked him again about Pinochet, and he said, well, he's changed his opinion a little because he can see now that Chile had a much stronger and solid middle class that made those reforms possible, whereas Russia was just not, the Russian population was just not yet prepared for any such reforms. But nevertheless, in principle, of course, Pinochet would show the right way. So I'm coming to the end. So what am I making out of that? So as I, of course, already indicated several times, I think research into Russian elites offers a very, very good mirror and into all kind of aspects that are widespread among Western elites as well, but we might not see them so clearly. For example, when it comes to biological supremacy, we know from some studies, especially psychological studies in the States and some others, that if you dig a little deeper, yes, Western elites are almost equally convinced that they are biologically stronger, genetically have a better genetic setup than normal people do, and it also, of course, helped them to become that successful. However, of course, Western elites would never ever be so blunt and straightforward expressing those ideas. And that has, I would say, also a consequence on the empirical data sociologists researching elites have come up with, because in interviews, people tend much rather to talk about their meritocratic achievements based on hard work, willpower, maybe some innovative thinking of the sort, but because they are not that blunt in expressing their ideas about their biological superiority, is also something I would say that suffers a little in, or lacks a little in overall in our scholarship. But if you look to Russia, that's actually a way to, their bluntness takes us in many ways right into the heart of Western capitalism. And basically Russians express a lot of things in a certain directness that are much more widespread, go beyond the borders of Russia, and they gave us a very strong lens into this area. The same is true for the strong beliefs into neoliberalism. I was first wondering, it's a bit odd that Arvin, sitting around in London that much, has never ever softened his narrative about Pinochet, and that kind of he's never ever felt maybe that's not the way one should speak anymore. And then I was thinking, well, just the other day I met for a walk a friend of mine who is a diehard Tory, and Margaret Thatcher famously loved Pinochet too, and he kind of would never ever, he said the same, Pinochet is wonderful, in a tradition of Margaret Thatcher, who he would never ever want to betray. But then I thought maybe it's not quite the end of the story. In a discussion with Hanna Kusula, she said that Finnish IT elites are quite open in their anti-democratic ideas, thinking they're just the best, and if they were running the states, they would do a much better job. And I was quite surprised about it. She also referred to Silicon Valley elites, who some of them have similar thinking. And then just a few days afterwards, I finally watched The Social Dilemma, the Netflix documentary, which so many of my students had watched. No idea how they got through these 2 hours. That easily took me about 3 attempts. But the most interesting thing of it was actually then the last couple of minutes, when all these people who criticized Facebook from front to back were invited to say what alternative they see. And what they said in the end was not something maybe we should make social media more democratic, maybe we should make them less dependent on big tech capital and all these kind of things. No, what they said was big tech should be run by people who are decent and stick to their values. So basically an idea where very similar, if only it was run by me because I'm better, then things would be fine without having a kind of a bigger picture of maybe that's not the end of the story if you want to have things run more democratically. So there might be also a wider picture in that terms. But then there's a last point which I haven't yet kind of made sense of, and that is also related to history and something where I can't see any parallel to any other country, and that is this kind of strange thing that usually when you look at meritocracy among rich people, it's something we research in the present. It's something they also developed quite recently, whereas a good part of the meritocratic beliefs among rich Russians are heavily anchored in the past, in their intelligentsia upbringing, in the whole myth around the intelligentsia and the whole kind of worth it attaches to them. And that's, I find it's quite curious because their intelligentsia upbringing and the whole ideas around it preceded the time when capitalists existed in their country, of course, but it also preceded a time when the world got used to the term neoliberalism. So it's something so kind of deeply anchored in a past that didn't see either of it, but also is so important for the identity today that is in many ways, I would say, quite curious. But overall, just the last sentence, my big appeal is that post-Russia's elites are actually quite an interesting testing ground for how capitalist moralities can develop, and also one way we can so nicely see it happening in real time rather than having to go to the archives and do historical research.
All right, thank you very, very much for that very interesting presentation. We will now open up the floor for anybody who would like to comment or add something to Elisabeth's discussion. And while we wait for people to, you can make yourself, you can request for a comment by raising your hand. I know that there are some differences between the different Zoom softwares. In my version, it's on the reaction button at the bottom, and some people have it on their participant. But raise your hand, and if and if you can't find the raise hand function, you can write in the chat, and I will give you the word. So just to get started, I would like to start by asking you a question about the very interesting, I think, parallels you mentioned with the Finnish case, because what struck me when I read your book was, which is I think a profound historical analysis of how you can both sort of play with available discourses, but also are shaped by ways of thinking and seeing. So for instance, with your explanation on the usage of biology, you contextualize that in how the scientific discourse around biology has been or was in the 60s in Russia. And I think that's very, very interesting. But I also wonder a bit if some of the accounts that you have in your material, I agree, resemble a bit with what Hanna Kysela and Anna Kantula find in this Finnish case. And I think one of the parallels with those two studies is that you manage to get access to the very, very top, so to speak, very, very wealthy. And I wonder if what's your reflection on the need for those billionaires to legitimize their standing vis-a-vis the people, or whether it becomes this detached, where you can say things like the poor are lazy, or I'm just very smart, or things that we are a bit surprised maybe to read or to get quotes that say. So to what extent do you find that maybe these like super elites have these notions in very different contexts also? Yeah, and maybe that has to do with the detachment of their position. I don't know, but I agree that there are some parallels that are very interesting.
Interesting question. I would say about the Russian elites, they're completely detached, and their quests for legitimacy are mostly directed towards their fellow rich and Western elites, and the Russian population as such it's not negligent. So that it is important for them also the idea of legitimizing private capital and rebuild its reputation and things. It is important on some level, but otherwise completely it's not the main target group. And it's interesting that saying that the thing is, and that's why I also was surprised about Hannah's study and this tech people's openness, but I haven't come across many other studies where rich people are so without any inhibitions. So it just doesn't happen that much. If you, for example, compare it to Sherman's New York study, they're super careful in many ways what they say, and in many Katarina Hecht's study among rich in London, of course they say in some ways some surprising things, but I can't see them ever go that far to make such brash statements. Of course, there are exceptions when Boris Johnson is a famous case who loves talking about genetical superiority of the British establishment, but it's not a kind of a very, very widespread phenomenon, I would say. So it seems to me like a little bit that many elites in the West have kind of learned how to control what they say a little bit more than the Russians have.
All right, thank you for that. We have 2 questions, and before you speak, it's good if you can present yourself so that the audience will know who you are. We start with Tomasz.
I think Magna was the first. Something wrong with my camera, so I switched to. Can you see me? Yes, okay. So hi Elisabeth, thanks for the great talk. I have something like a methodological question pertaining to what your last comment also. To what extent they consider the conversation with you as something public? Because I think that may be a problem that those Western great business people are really very aware that anything they say will become public, and because they are so important in the the entire social structure, so a single sentence may become a trouble for them. While maybe this fact that the Russians tell you quite strange things sometimes, at least from the Western point of view. They talk to you, but they assume that this is something private, even if you say that you are a researcher and you will use these interviews, but because they know that they are so marginal in the, especially the Russian, broader Russian, especially political public field, that they don't really think seriously about their statements. So the problem maybe not only with what you said, that they are not used, that they are not so strategic, but their position is simply so marginal in the Russian context of the Russian field of power, that they don't have to care so much about what they say, because, well, to simplify things, their relationship to Kremlin is more important to their position that whatever they say to Western researchers on either media. Thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say, especially in the second part, when among the billionaires, I felt they were quite used to giving interviews, and they knew pretty much what they were saying. For example, in Arvin's case, he happily says the same in media interviews, where he knows, of course, they will get published. But of course, also was clear there would have been no chance that it would go in with a consent form and have it signed by them, and then they talk and they can just write whatever I want. It was absolutely clear. If I use their names, then I have to get that approved by them. But he was most happy to. The only thing Arvin actually, when I sent him the quotes, I wanted to use, the only thing he didn't like was funny enough, something about Jewish backgrounds and the stigmatization they had, and also, of course, the anti-Semitism, which became again strong in the 1980s and blocked for some of them the way into some careers and educational institutions. And that was the one thing he wanted to be cut out, that he's ever experienced anything of the sort. But otherwise, they seem, I mean, also Yekaterina, for example, she knew inside out what she was saying. She was also kind of creating a certain image of herself, and that was very much part of it. So, yeah. Actually, those who were just blubbering away were of lower state, kind of less wealth, and yeah. So interesting question. I need to think about it more, but I don't think it's a very widespread phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
All right, then we have a question by Magna.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, hi, my name is Magne Flemmen. I'm with the University of Oslo. Thank you for a really fascinating talk, Elisabeth. I think this is just tremendously impressive work and really fascinating findings. I just have a question about the kind of biological or genetic kind of mode of legitimation, if we could put it that way. I think you were. I'm wondering if I'm getting your argument right. It seems to me that you're suggesting that the reliance on kind of on genes or biology as a kind of explanation of their status is not actually, I think you're suggesting, not actually specific to the Russians. It's just that they would say it out loud, whereas you're suggesting that, say, British elites or German elites or something would actually think the same thing but don't say it. Is this am I getting you correctly?
Yes, that's my assumption, or certainly something I think deserves more attention. I mean, sometimes you do come across similar statements, but they're usually phrased in a much more cautious and beautiful way, and not kind of coming in this like an avalanche towards you. So yes, I would think it's something. But just this kind of overall discourse we have in the West of, and also the influence of feminists and critical social sciences, where I think people learned a certain lesson of not doing that so bluntly.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, something I think would be fascinating to research. There's this Krauss, this psychologist from the States, who did this fascinating study asking people from all kinds of social classes whether it's the conditions they live in that the most influential, or their own biological ability. And there was a very, very nice, beautiful line: the higher up he went, the more people said it's biology. And that also included people who were born, of course, into big fortunes and business dynasties, and nevertheless they were convinced it's biology.
All right, thank you. We have also a question in the chat due to bad connection. I'll read it out loud so that it's so everybody hears. It's from Marcos Gonzalez Hernando. He says, "Hi Elisabeth, I really like the parallel you make with Pinochet. It reminds me that Chile's traditional land-owning elite at the time, still railing from the land reforms that started in the 1960s, transformed itself into a new neoliberal elite in the 70s and 80s, especially through the privatization of state assets. The surnames tend to be the same to this day, not to mention that a part of it became from an international intellectual networks, the Chicago Boys. So my question is, how far does a parallel in terms of elite go?"
That's very interesting. The parallel certainly fits in terms of getting cheap bargains, which I assume must have been the case too in Chile, hopefully not to that extent that it was the case in the 90s in Russia, but that people got rich on cheap bargains through privatization processes. In terms of the land owning, that's a big difference. The Russian, the Soviet intelligentsia had its privileges, especially if they worked in nuclear physics, for example, and also material privileges to some extent. But of course, there was no capitalism in the Soviet Union, so you didn't have people who actually accumulated any money or owned, or for that kind of preceding phenomenon of kind of being land owning. There was nothing of that sort. So in that terms, it's not comparable, but yeah, it's a classic of radical neoliberal reforms that, of course, the new capitalists benefit a lot from from state assets that gets cheaply sold off to a few. The Chicago Boys, yeah. The Russians, Soviets intelligentsia, that they just were absolutely hanging on their lips. They're still completely convinced if only private capital develops, everything will fall in place. But I also expect the state and the Kremlin to support them along the way. For example, Arvind said, when I asked him about social inequality, he said, well, it's a question of social mobility, and social mobility is not my duty. Social mobility is a question of policy, and responsible for that is the state. So a lot of kind of tricky issues in society, they're most happy to outsource to the state and make the state responsible for it, and not bother about it themselves.
Okay, I'll jump in with another question. Since nobody else signed up for now, I wonder a little bit. You mentioned that you got one feedback from one of your interview or your informants, but do you have the sense that your book has been read by your informants? Have you gotten any response? Are they offended? Are they? I mean, have you gotten any angry letters or phone calls?
Oh, no single one. I mean, I had to be very careful. OUP hired a libel lawyer, and first I thought, oh gosh, that will kind of drag on things even more. But in the end, it turned out to be a really good thing, because I think I would have ended up self-censoring much, much more had I had to take all the decision myself, because there were so many cases where I thought, I'm kind of in the final edit, may I say that, mustn't I? And the libel lawyer was quite interesting because he was very, very relaxed about many things. So I thought, oh gosh, well, fair enough. He wasn't relaxed about anything had to go that was mentioning Botox and beauty surgeries, no way. But also everything had to go that mentions mistresses and prostitutes, no way, he said out. And he was also concerned that the people, he was less concerned about the people who are used by name, because with them I had to agree those things, and that was fine. He actually didn't want me to agree with all of them, and I made a mistake. I did an interview with Konstantin Ernst, who runs Channel 1, Russia's biggest TV channel, and I received so much good feedback before that I thought, oh, I'll write to him as well. And he then said, well, it was actually the last interview, just a year before, so the interview was ages ago, and I thought you were doing that for an academic publication and not a book and so on. But otherwise, no, that wasn't his concern. His major concern of this libel lawyer was that the people I anonymized would have no chance to identify themselves. And at first also I made a lot of people, I thought I made them much nicer, so they should be fine. And he said, no, you don't do that. You must rather tend to make them uglier, because if they are presented as ugly and unpleasant, they are much, much less likely to A, think it's them, can't be them, and B, make a fuss out of it, because they don't want to kind of point out to this nasty person that it might be them. But no, I did get maybe a couple of people of my interviews I talked to, but no angry letter whatsoever. I think they kind of, I have impression, they feel I do them justice.
Well, that's good to hear. We have a question by Brian Boyle.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, Brian Boyle from the Free University of Brussels, PhD student. I have quite a niche methodological question. I hope it's not too much off topic, but I saw in your book that in addition to interviewing the rich people themselves, you also did a series of expert interviews with people who work close to them. So, for example, architects, personal assistants, I think interior designers as well. I was just wondering, I'm curious whether you could reflect on the sort of the methodological value of those perspectives. I mean, as people who work close to them, kind of how much do they know about them, and sort of how much can they be used as, yeah, methodologically to learn more about elites, especially given the usual insular nature of elites. And yeah, were there any discrepancies, or were there any major discrepancies between the way that they viewed them versus the way that the rich people viewed themselves? So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Major discrepancy is an interesting question. So this Piotr Arvan, he was among quite a range of billionaires who said they would not give their children, basically in the Bill Gates tradition, they wouldn't give their children a lot of their inheritance. Most of it will go to charity. And one of my interviews, Roman Avdeyev, a billionaire, he actually kind of is quite strict on that. He has 23 children, 4 of them biological, and they get the best education, a flat accommodation, and a good car, but that's it. And from tales from his son, he seems to actually act on that pretty strictly. But Piotr Arvan was also one among those who said no, must go to charity. You just kind of, if you give too much to your children, you don't allow them to prove themselves. And I learned from a former student of mine who is very close friends with one of Arvan's children, that's not quite the case. So of course, there's also this kind of idea of buying the son a house for 150 million is just their accommodation and not passing on inheritance. But I was in total, it's kind of not quite true. And also just for starts, they went to, both children I believe went to Yale, and that was preceded by Arwen becoming a very, very, very important patron and donor to Yale University. So there are all kind of ways of treating yourself in your own self-perception. In terms of the experts, it was kind of, I wasn't very clever on that front for long, because there was also a very odd thing. Some people, it's so dependent on, when I talk to people, on whether I had any ability to analyze and kind of give you a certain idea, sort of maybe just storytell about the rich people they have dealings with. And they could be the most educated and people in absolutely kind of high management positions who I met, and they were just absolutely incapable of providing any information. And of course, other people provided a lot of gossip, but I only recorded those interviews where I actually sat down with people, experts, and I didn't do it very systematically either, because I actually wanted to get to proper rich people through them rather than asking them for information that much. But what I should have done, which I didn't do, is to record, take field notes all the time when chatting to people at dinner parties, drinks receptions and so on. When they ask me, oh, what you're doing? So, oh, it's funny, I run this chats, private chat company, and we were flying around Friedman, an oligarch, and standing whole tales, absolute curious tales about this oligarch's behavior. And I kind of had at first this idea of, because it was so informal, that it didn't occur to me to write it down on paper and maybe use it for later. And yeah, I lost a lot by not doing that. But I would say they kind of, the informal chats are the most, the richest for that purpose.
Thank you.
Anybody else wants to jump in? All right, well, I think we've had a lovely discussion now. It's been very good. So unless there are some last minute comments coming in.
Maybe I'll tell you a little story. I thought yesterday should I include it or not, and decided not to. But just going back to this point of how Western social scientists kind of strangely don't want to draw a comparison with Western elites and Russian rich. There was a strange situation. It was during my Viva, and both the examiners were actually people who are very, very concerned about questioning Eurocentric ideas about how Russia is researched and what kind of conclusions we take away from that. But there was one thing they wanted me to rework on my chapter, or maybe set up a new chapter on gender. I can't quite remember, and draw it up much more around masculinity, which totally made sense, was absolutely fine. But then they wanted me to make much more of one episode, which I'd actually put in a footnote, and which was I saw as I was thinking, should I include it or not at all? That was the story. So I went to an interview and thought the person from the contact person would be kind of eligible to be elite interviewee. And I realized very quickly when I walked in, it's not the case at all. The contact person got it completely wrong. It was an artist who paints for very rich people, so he would kind of maybe qualify as an expert, but he was completely useless. And it started off with me sitting on the sofa, and I got all kind of tea ceremony. He was into kind of Asian things, all kind of Japanese and other tea ceremonies, and was also telling me about the bears he encountered in Siberian tiger and how he was fighting them. He was always moving closer to me. We made the whole round around the sofa, me moving away, him moving closer. And he was completely useless in any sense. But then later on, he was quite fidgety, and he then decided he wants to show me his knife throwing skills, and started kind of using some in the corner. And he was good at that. I don't think he was in any danger, but it was all very odd. But he was a complete kind of outlayer of anything, and he didn't even qualify to join the sample. But nevertheless, and this was quite odd, my examiners, they were adamant that I bring in that story into the main parts and build things up around it. So they had to kind of, I then thought afterwards, so maybe the academics should be reading more tabloid press and glossy magazines in order to get this kind of entertaining side from there, because it felt so much that they just loved the story, and also kind of, even though they understood my argument throughout, they're also very, very keen to bring in this story, even though it was completely not fitting, as something of how I should present masculinity in Russia. And I still remember that as something almost indicative, especially because this was the two were people who were so concerned about not falling into Western stereotypes when looking at Russia. So
that's very interesting. If I can come with a follow-up question to that, actually, because I think you have some very nice observations about gender dynamics in your book, and I think that's. Can you elaborate a bit more about the gender dynamics within the couples that you observed, and also the wealthy women and their how gender was entwined in their notions of self and views on themselves in the Russian society?
Well, for a start, I was hoping right from the beginning that I should be able to do a lot of interviews with the ladies of leisure, because they have all the time at their hands. But because most social networks I got into in order to build up, kind of find interviewees, are somehow social life business based, and they automatically led me to males and not females. And when I asked interviewees, male interviewees, whether I could talk to their wives, it was exclusively men whose wives were either running their own business or running some presentable charity or something. And when I kind of could have a guess that their wives were of the lady of leisure sides, no chance to ever be referred to them. So I missed out a lot on that front. But in general, kind of one thing that's been coming up recently quite a bit in also among our lot of sociologists into elites is the idea that philanthropy charity is a female thing. And I got very much kind of, and I don't think that's only a Russian phenomenon. Be careful about that, because yes, of course, charities can be run, like in the case of this Irina Sedich, by the wife, But when it comes to the things that really have prestige, like writing an article, kind of setting up a big new museum, then it is almost always a big male project. So we've got in Moscow Abramovich, it was run by his now ex-wife, and now Michelson, who was the British Russian maybe 3 years or so ago, and Michelson set up an even bigger contemporary art center. This former student I mentioned before, he said, well, it's kind of course, they're comparing the length of their penises. Art center needs to be bigger than of the fellow oligarch. And they then allowed, in Michelson's case, his daughter to run the space, but nevertheless, his idea, his concept, his design and everything. And of course, they also want to have their name attached to it. And in terms of couple behavior, it was in some cases, because this new bourgeoisie, many of them got bored doing business and also have a certain idea that doing business is something dirty and vulgar, and now in their last stage of life, fully engaged in philanthropy. And it was done in some cases that it was their wives taking over business matters, and they are themselves setting up their art collections and things like that. So it's kind of, it's a kind of a very convoluted thing, gender relation historically and in general in Russia. But there's some elements where I would say it's trickier than one might expect.
Thank you for that. So we have another question from Vitalina Dragim.
Yes, hi, I'm a PhD student in Paris, and I also research Russian elites, but more from a quantitative point of view. And I have a couple of methodological questions, actually. So it may have been mentioned before, but I missed it. I would like to know how you studied your interviews. Where did your very first contacts come from? And what was that contact? How did you manage to persuade them? And did they know what you were doing exactly? And the second one, did you manage to record your interviews, or did your interviewees not agree to this? Thank you.
Thanks. Almost all of them agreed to be recorded. Except for in one of the latest interviews, it was with Magomedov, billionaire, who is now, he must be sitting in pre-trial detention for a couple of years now. And if things go badly for him, he'll be in some, like Navalny, in some labor camp for not like Navalny only 2 years and 8 months, but for up to 20 years. And it's an odd thing. I mean, that was also a situation where I walked in and they had to put everything away. They had a certain kind of paranoia and kind of big bouncers from Dagestan taking off my mobile phone and everything kind of other device or bag I had on me. But otherwise, they all allowed me to record. So that was no issue whatsoever. And how I got to the interviews was whatever 2 steps. So it took me about 100 years to get all these interviews together. And in the first phase, I started in 2008. I just asked everybody who I knew whether they might know someone. And it was quite interesting because some of the kind of, I thought kind of most hopeful intermediaries, people working in high positions in business, they were the least helpful. It was also a funny thing. Very often they would kind of look up and down on me. And one thing back then was kind of an obsession in Russia in the late 10s with shoes. You were assessed and evaluated on what shoes you were wearing, and I often didn't pass this test. So it was very clear that they thought, I'm not wasting my valuable elite contact for this girl. Much more helpful were kind of quite random people. There was, for example, one left-wing intellectual I ran into at a rally on 1st of May. He was a kind of a part of rally with anarchists and other groups. And I told him about my project, and he said, "Oh, the bourgeoisie, oh, that sounds very Marxist." And he then opened his telephone book and gave me dozens and dozens of numbers. And of course, you can ask, why did he have them? But in that case, it was the person is someone who's been such a central figure of the dissident movement. But at the same time, Moscow is very, very centralized, such a central figure of all this kind of life over the last decades, that he still had a lot of contacts and most happily pass them on to me. There was another case, it was a journalist, Austrian journalist. I found him quite snooty and I asked him whether he would help me, and again, so it's not worth helping her. But then he noticed she would run into those people all the time in Moscow, of course, the Austrian community. He noticed, oh, Elisabeth is having some success, so maybe I should give her some of my phone numbers, and she will give me her contacts in return. So we basically started trading phone numbers. And back then was also strange things, because he gave me private mobile phone numbers. So some of the people I just had to give a cold call, some were not pleased. But for example, one of them, Jakubashvili, an oligarch, he listened and he said, "Oh, why not?" and invited me for an interview. That changed a lot by the time I started my my postdoc project. By the time 2015, no chance she would get private telephone numbers, mobile phone numbers of any oligarchs. But then I worked through the Forbes list and wrote formal letters. By the time I was, a lot of the media or PR people of big companies have become much more, civilized. The first period they would just not reply, but by the time in 2015 they did reply, and sometimes it worked out. But I mean, there was also a phase when it started, was my postdoc, hunting for an academic job, and I can say in total, it's much easier to land an interview with an oligarch than it was for me landing a job interview.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's discouraging or.
I'm just wondering myself. It might have been just me.
All right. Any other questions, thoughts? I know there are a lot of people that are participating that are doing similar stuff and asking some more questions, but all right. Well, maybe we should call it up then. Yeah. Okay. Well, then I think we would like to thank you so much, Elisabeth, for a very, very interesting session and a great presentation. And
thank you very much for inviting me.
Those of you who haven't read the book, I recommend it. And we look forward to also seeing your new publications on the moralities out there. So for
Right.
yeah, the one. So we are the Classes and Elites Research Seminar. You can follow us on Twitter. We have a new seminar coming up in just a couple of weeks, and we have many more lined up for the spring semester. So please come back. And thank you all for participating.
Thanks.